those unfamiliar with the Sudanese revolution, it erupted in December 2018 over the price of bread and against the 30-year dictatorship of al-Bashir. Tens of millions of Sudanese have taken part in the revolt, with mass demonstrations of hundreds of thousands in the capital Khartoum a common feature. Strikes by tens of thousands of workers across Sudan were also common, and so too was the proliferation of new democratic organising bodies, whether independent trade unions or neighbourhood resistance committees. The mass sit-ins at Tahrir Square at the centre of Khartoum involved tens of thousands protesting and sleeping overnight. And the sit-in created new bodies to decide how the sit-in should run, how to get food and medicine, and even a medical tent for those injured by the attacks from security forces. This mirrored a similar dynamic during the Arab Spring of 2011, which saw similar sit-ins, most famously by protesters in Cairo. The situation in Sudan today, however, is catastrophic. 11 million Sudanese people are displaced out of a population of just under 50 million, and it's estimated that 150,000 people, mostly civilians, have been killed as a result of the civil war that broke out in April last year. And the situation continues to deteriorate, with famine declared over large areas of Sudan and over half the population needing humanitarian aid to survive. The brutality of both the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese armed forces against unarmed civilians, children, and especially women has been documented by human rights groups. The two warring generals, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan of the Sudanese Armed Forces and General Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hemedti, of the Rapid Support Forces, are fighting for control not just over the Sudanese state and its prized resources, but also the Sudanese people who made a revolution. Both the generals were united in attempting to crush the revolution since late 2018, carrying out joint massacres of peaceful protests and terrorising the millions of Sudanese people that took to the streets demanding the fall of the dictator and real democracy. In October 2021, both generals led a coup against the transitional civilian government in an attempt to set back the gains of the revolution. The generals are now fighting over who will have total control over Sudan and its people, and neither side is concerned at the cost. Regional sub-imperial powers have flooded Sudan with weapons to the rival sides, fueling the slaughter. What I want to talk about tonight is the history of the Sudanese revolution and the potential it held to transform Sudan from a dictatorship to a completely new democratic society. By going over a brief history of the revolution, I want to draw out what the nature of the Sudanese state is and the role that the army plays in capitalism. I also want to talk about why the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, are two sides of the same oppressive coin, and that one side should not be backed against the other. The RSF is part of the ruling class of the Sudanese state, and the atrocities it is committing have been enabled by decades of state sponsorship. The conventional army, the SAF, is likewise a murderous entity that does not hesitate to kill protesters when they threaten state power. Neither the SAF or the RSF has a role to play in the liberation of Sudan and the cessation of the catastrophe. I won't be able to discuss the Sudanese revolution in enough detail to do it justice, and I will only have time to discuss the state and the army in broad outlines. So I really encourage comrades to contribute to the discussion and to ask any questions and for any clarifications. So I'll start with a brief history of the Sudanese revolution. Prior to April 2019, Sudan had been ruled by a brutal dictatorship under al-Bashir for 30 years. But when Bashir's regime enacted policies that tripled the price of bread in late December 2018, protests broke out across Sudan. Quickly, the protests were not just against the bread prices, but against Bashir's entire regime. A popular story goes that the revolution started in the peripheral city of Atbara when a student was angered he couldn't afford a falafel sandwich due to the bread price increases. Other students joined in the outrage, and by the next day, the ruling party's headquarters had been burnt down in Atbara and revolt had spread across the country. I think there's a lesson there about how students can often be the first in society to react to crisis and can be a spark that sets off broader revolts. And soon workers were on strike in Sudan as well. In late 2019, 1,800 port workers in Port Sudan struck against privatisation of the port, and activists mobilising for the anti-government protests embraced the strike as part of a generalised revolt against the regime. The port workers even used a shipping container to blockade the port, which should give us inspiration for the next time we attempt to do a Zim blockade. Massive popular sit-ins soon started on April 6 in the capital Khartoum, but also in the provincial capitals as well. In Khartoum, the sit-in was outside the Sudanese Armed Forces General Command in Tahrir Square. Some young soldiers and officers, part of the security forces, whether they were in the Sudanese Armed Forces or the Rapid Support Forces, actually refused to fire on demonstrations and even defended the sit-in against the generals and the soldiers who were attacking the protesters. On April 11, the dictator's generals, al-Burhan and Hamedi, were forced to remove him from power. In a few months, the 30-year dictatorship had fallen. The Transitional Military Council was established to negotiate a transfer of power to a civilian government. The head of the Transitional Military Council, the TMC, was the General al-Burhan and Hamedi was the deputy. The TMC was not able to demobilise the popular movement that was in command of the streets. The TMC was forced into negotiations to transfer power to a civilian government. I want to talk quickly now about the neighbourhood resistance committees in Sudan, because they help to coordinate the mass protests, the sit-ins and the generalised resistance against the military rule. The neighbourhood resistance committees were a central feature of the Sudanese revolution. The resistance committees predate the revolution, but they exploded in number once the revolution started. The resistance committees were based on neighbourhoods and soon took on tasks like coordinating marches, gathering intelligence on the location of the police, and adjusting street barricades and march routes. They even took on ensuring the supply of flour to bakeries and medicines to pharmacies. The resistance committees were important because they allowed mass democratic involvement in the revolutionary process and discussion about how to drive it forward. This was similar to the Soviets or workers' councils, but the fundamental and crucial difference was that the resistance committees were not based on the workplaces, but rather the neighbourhoods, and so they lacked the direct link to workers' power. By 2021, there were over 5,800 recorded resistance committees across Sudan, with 812 in the capital Khartoum alone. To give a sense of the scale of the organisation, Khartoum had a population of over 6 million people. In Sydney, there's a bit over 5 million people and 650 suburbs. So if Sydney was Khartoum, there'd be at least one resistance committee per suburb. So back to 2019. In response to the massive demonstrations, the Sudanese state used its special bodies of armed men, the police and the military in the form of the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, to commit a massacre against the sit-in at Tahrir Square in Khartoum. The armed forces stormed the sit-in, killing over 180 protesters and beating, assaulting and raping scores of demonstrators. The protesters on the barricades were from the poorest areas of Khartoum, and anger quickly spread across the country. Another general strike and mass demonstration forced the signing of a final deal to confirm the exact composition of the transitional government. But the agreement had many shortcomings. The civilian elites who were part of the negotiations agreed to let the military have a power-sharing agreement with the new civilian government. The role of the military generals al-Burhan and Hamedi in the state was never confronted, and their power was not challenged. By October 2021, the generals were emboldened by the support they had received from regional and international states and seized power from their civilian partners in a coup. The first civilian prime minister of the transitional government was placed under house arrest by the generals. The generals would never allow a civilian government that threatened their power and their profits. The coup was met by mass protests, civil disobedience and strikes, and crucially these were led not by the civilian parties ousted from the transitional government during the coup, but they were actually led by the neighbourhood resistance committees. As the revolution developed, the resistance committees began to take on a more prominent role, not just in organising protests, but releasing political charters that detailed the demands of the revolutionaries and how to get there. Resistance committees in Khartoum formed the coordinations of resistance committees of Khartoum and released a charter in 2021 to set out the transition to civilian rule and to reform the army. They emphasised that the Prime Minister should be appointed first, then the National Assemblies after. The Resistance Committee of Wad Madani, however, emphasised that any new government should be formed from the bottom up, with elections first taking place on a local level before the National Council and the Prime Minister. So what was being debated, even if not explicitly, was whether the resistance committees themselves could form an alternative basis for state power that was different to and outside the existing state structures. This posed the question of who should hold power over Sudan: the people through their bodies like the resistance committees, or through elected elites like elsewhere in the supposedly democratic world. There was a real possibility that the revolution would deepen and activists would spread the organisation of the revolution into the workplaces, not just in the neighbourhoods. But despite the mass protests and the generals' inability to put the movement down, the generals continued to hold on to power. This now brings us to the fighting that broke out between the generals in April 2023. Since they launched the coup against the transitional government, al-Burhan and Hemedti have become wary that the other might be out to do them over and become the sole ruler of Sudan. The resulting war between the generals is a consequence of the twists and turns of the revolution and the failure of the revolutionaries to take on and smash the special bodies of armed men that protect the state. The revolutionary movement in Sudan is in deep crisis, and currently it isn't able to counter the devastation wrought on it by the warring generals. Fundamentally, the power to reinvigorate the revolutionary movement in Sudan now lies beyond its borders and could be reignited by revolt in Egypt or other Middle Eastern countries. So now I want to talk about why the generals would never allow for civilian rule in Sudan and the role the army plays in all capitalist states. I also want to talk briefly about what the state is under capitalism. So Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin argued that the state arises out of class antagonisms between workers and capitalists. Conflict is built into class society. Because the ruling class is a minority, it needs the state to protect its rule from the uprising of the majority of workers. The state does not stand separate from society. It is not a neutral body able to mediate between the conflicting classes. It was created by the ruling class to serve its interests. Marx and Engels were very clear. The working class cannot take hold of the existing state machinery and use it for its own purposes. Instead, the working class must smash the capitalist state completely. The state is not just parliament, but it's the army, the courts, the police, the prisons, and even the education systems. The army and the police have a monopoly of violence, and the army is the last line of defence for the capitalist state when it is threatened by revolution. In countries like Sudan, the army is used overwhelmingly against its own working class. This is because the working class in countries like Sudan pose a more consistent threat to the power of the ruling class, and the army is the ultimate force that protects them. It is not surprising that the generals come to see themselves as embodying the state, the final arbiter of law and order and class rule. And as Lenin wrote, the repressive institutions of the state, the special bodies of armed men in the army and the police, will use violence to overthrow any government that poses a real threat to capitalism and the wealth of the ruling class. In the case of Sudan, both al-Burhan of the Sudanese armed forces, the conventional military, and Hemedti of the rapid support forces control vast swathes of the Sudanese economy, and they also help protect the Sudanese capitalist class. Both al-Burhan and Hemedti fear that their wealth will be threatened by civilian rule. It's also important to point out that Hemedti and the rapid support forces were legitimised by the West through the murderous refugee policy called the Khartoum Process, set up in 2014. Under the Khartoum Process, European Union states funneled millions of dollars to the RSF so they could act as border guards for Europe. The RSF kidnapped, assaulted and murdered refugees and asylum seekers trying to get out of Sudan. And in Australia, in our government's bid to become one of the world's top 10 arms exporters, Weapons have been shipped to Sudan's generals, even after the massacre of the sit-in in 2019 and after the genocide in Darfur. Fighters from the Rapid Support Forces were also used as mercenaries by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates during the murderous assault on Yemen after the Yemeni people took part in their own revolution during the wave of revolutions of the Arab Spring. The wealth and power that al-Burhan and Hemedti have accumulated over the years can only be taken from them by breaking apart their armies and establishing democratic control over armed force through revolutionary bodies. But the potential of the revolutionary movement in Sudan to again rise up is severely curtailed by the ongoing war. And with sub-imperial powers fueling the conflict, the war between the generals shows no sign of stopping anytime soon. The war between the generals is seen by sub-imperial powers as an opportunity to extend their own power and wealth in the region. Sudan contains huge amounts of gold, precious arable land, and has a strategic stretch of Red Sea coastline close to the Suez Canal. Russia is supporting the Sudanese armed forces in exchange for being able to establish a naval base on the Red Sea, which is a crucial strategic point for global trade given how much of it flows through the Suez Canal. The United Arab Emirates is backing the RSF, while Egypt and Saudi Arabia, as well as Iran, have thrown their support behind the SAF. Without the weapons provided by the sub-imperial powers, the devastation and slaughter in Sudan could not continue at its current intensity. This underlines the fact that imperialism isn't a game simply among the world's most powerful states. The sub-imperial powers play a similar game to the US, who tries to use its military strength and economic and diplomatic mechanisms to ruthlessly pursue its interests globally. The relative decline of the US goes hand in hand with the growing willingness of these sub-imperialist powers to throw their weight around. As with all imperialism, it is ordinary people who are paying the bloody price in Sudan. Given that neither the Sudanese armed forces or the Rapid Support Forces is interested in the liberation of Sudanese people and the establishment of democracy, it is wrong to back one warring general against the other. Unfortunately, many are siding with the Sudanese armed forces, often justified by claiming that the RSF is worse than the SAF, and that any democratic state actually needs an army, so we must try and reform the current conventional army. But such a position is a mistake, and it can only lead to failure and more death and destruction. As I discussed previously, the army is there to protect the interests of the state, and that means ensuring the ability of capitalists to continue the process of exploitation of workers. The Sudanese armed forces, the conventional military, is not interested in establishing a democratic government that would seek to take its power away and threaten the profitability of Sudanese capitalists. It must be stressed that the Rapid Support Forces came from the Sudanese army and is part of the Sudanese state. The RSF grew out of the Janjaweed militia, which was originally established by dictator al-Bashir, the head of the Sudanese army at the time. Al-Bashir used the Janjaweed militia to put down a rebel insurgency in Darfur and cement the regime's control of the region. They did this through genociding 300,000 people in Darfur. The war between the generals is a war between two sides of the ruling class of Sudan. We cannot back one side of the ruling class over the other. What is needed is a revival of the mass movement that made the revolution, and a revolutionary party able to point the path forward to liberation. The revolutionary party must be able to take the lead of a revolution if it is to be successful. It must lead the class in its confrontation with the state and its special bodies of armed men in the army and the police. Without a theoretical understanding of the state, and that to establish real workers' democracy, the capitalist state needs to be smashed, the revolutionary process will stumble, and it will ultimately fail. It is important to point out that at every stage of the revolutionary process in Sudan, the army was there to try and curtail the movement and confine its demands to those that would not threaten the power of the military or the capitalist class. Sudanese revolutionaries have learnt bitter lessons from the past 5 years of revolt. The need for a revolutionary party in Sudan is more urgent than ever, and the Sudanese people need international solidarity and revolts big enough to stop the flow of arms into the country. The crisis in Sudan is ongoing, But the question of the state is something all mass movements and all revolutionaries struggling in the here and now, even if we're not challenging for state power, must confront. I hope that in the discussion we can talk about the role of the army in the state, sub-imperialism, and how we can see liberation not just for Sudan, but for the whole region.